Morning, everybody. Welcome to MLTalks. I'm Joe Ito, the director of the Media Lab. We'll be streaming this, so if you're watching online, we'll be following the Twitter stream. So if you use the hashtag MLTalks, we'll be looking for comments or questions. We'll have Marshall Ganz, who's our guest today, talk for about 30 minutes, and we'll have conversation, and then we'll involve the audience in the Twitter stream. I could go on and explaining Marshall, but I think he's going to talk about himself a bit. So I'll let him do the deep dive in who is Marshall. But he's a great mentor to me, to the Media Lab, to society. He's an expert on public narrative, social movements. He's quite a legendary person, so we're really excited to have him here to share his wisdom and his thoughts on a very timely topic at a very timely time. So with that, Marshall, if you could take it away.
Thanks, Joey. It's a little strange with this young fella up on the screen behind me. It's, yeah, like what moment are we in? Actually, that moment, that picture, was a moment in a strike by farm workers in California in 1973, trying to win union recognition. The person to my left is Dolores Huerta, who was one of the leaders of the farm worker organizing effort, along with Cesar Chavez. And the other three people are all from Yemen. They're Yemeni farm workers brought to work in the fields in California. And the occasion there was the funeral of the first striker to lose his life in the farm worker struggle in California, beaten to death by a deputy sheriff in Kern County. And so the first funeral in the farm worker world, which was mostly Mexican Roman Catholics, was a Muslim funeral led by an imam. So there's just a lot packed into that little moment and that I wanted to share. So I think the best way for me to start is really, we just had a brief discussion before this session about public narrative, but I want to frame what I'm going to say with an approach to leadership that is helpful, at least for me, for grounding the context in which I do this work. And those are these three questions posed by Rabbi Hillel, the first century Jerusalem scholar, who, when asked, how do I think about what to do in the world, responded with three questions to ask yourself. And the first question to ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Which is not meant to be a selfish question, but it is meant to be a self-regarding question. To ask yourself, if you presume to engage with others, then you better be clear about your own values, what you expect from it. Secondly, though, he says, ask yourself, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others in the world. And our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with theirs as well. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but recognition of the fact that rarely can we learn to do well what we want to do until we actually begin to do it. In other words, that action requires a leap into the uncertain and the unknown, because the future is unknown. And it's an illusion that someday we will be fully prepared and then the world will simply conform to our expectations. So for me, the interaction of self, other, and this understanding of action is about what leadership is about. And it is challenging because it presumes that the domain of leadership is not one of certainty but of uncertainty. It is a domain of the contradictory, the ambiguous, the unexpected, the novel. And that's challenging to the hands. It raises questions about skills. It's challenging, can I use my resources in new ways, a strategic challenge to the head. And it's challenging, where do I find the hope, where do I find the courage to do this? It's challenging to the heart. So it's sort of a head, hands, heart proposition when it comes to leadership and how it works. So the definition that I've come to use is that leadership is about accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. Now, the form of leadership to which I was introduced was organizing. And organizing is it's a particular form of leadership that begins by asking not what is the issue, but who are my people? Who is the community? Who are the people with whom I am engaging? The second question, what challenges do they face from their lived experience? Not what do I think they are, but what are they in terms of their own experience? And thirdly, how do I work with them to enable them to use their resources in new ways to develop the power that they need in order to achieve the change that they want and need? So it's not about providing services to clients. It's not about marketing products to customers. Neither one. It's about engaging a community of people in becoming a constituency. And the word constituency comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. So it is to bring people together, to stand together, learn together, decide together, act together, and hopefully win together. This tradition, organizing, is not something just invented at the Kennedy School. It's certainly by no means. One, in terms of the tradition to which I was introduced, it was rooted, first of all, a faith tradition that begins with the story of a journey from slavery to freedom, the Exodus story. And our faith traditions have been a source of this kind of understanding of people coming together to free themselves. When the Greeks decided they didn't need kings and decided they could govern themselves, as a civic tradition that goes into this exercise of voice. And of course, there's also, people have just found ways to assert their interests when they've needed to. For example, the tenant farmers of a British landlord in Ireland who withheld their produce because he wasn't making repairs needed. It took about 6 months, but eventually he did. And his name was Captain Boycott, which is where we get the word boycott, which has certainly been one of the most consistent nonviolent tools used by people to advance their interests or to protect their interests and assert them. My introduction to this came in 1964 when I was a junior at Harvard College and volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project. And the Summer Project was an effort to bring students from the North to support the work of African American organizers in Mississippi, challenging the whole regime of segregation and racial discrimination. And our job was to organize something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was going to be an integrated parallel to the regular Democrats that were segregated, and go to the Democratic Convention and challenge to get rid of them and seat our delegation. We were in Oxford, Ohio for training for this the night before it was time to leave. And we got word that 3 of our party had just disappeared, Andy Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. They had gone down a week earlier to Meridian, Mississippi, gone to Philadelphia, Mississippi to investigate a church burning, and had not been heard from since. Bob Moses, who was appropriately named the leader of our lead organizer, called us all together, like in a room like this, and said, we got word that our 3 brothers have disappeared. We don't know what happened, but we think we do know what happened. And sure enough, 2 months later, their bullet-riddled, beaten bodies were found buried in a dirt levee where they'd been taken by the Ku Klux Klan, having been turned over to them by the sheriffs in Philadelphia, Mississippi. We didn't know that, but we kind of knew that. And Bob said, look, I'd like to tell everybody, just go home, forget about this, but I can't. I need to ask you to go. And, you know, but he said, I can't take the whole responsibility. I have to ask everybody here to make your own choice. If you can't go, that's fine. There's no shame. But at that moment, I sank into my chair in silence, just like everybody else. You think to you, what am I doing here? Is this what I bought into? Is this, volunteering? Is this? And I began to reflect what I was doing there. My father was a rabbi, my mother a teacher. We lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War, where his work was mostly with Holocaust survivors, and I met people whose lives had been shattered by that horror. My parents interpreted the Holocaust to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism, and that racism kills. And the civil rights movement was challenging the institutionalized racism that's been part of this country's history since its founding. As a rabbi's kid, you have to go to all the stuff, all the things. Yeah, I don't know if there's any preacher's kids out there or whatever, but you're also supposed to be perfect, which is a different set of issues that I'm not going to get into. But I really loved the Passover Seders, the telling of the story of the Exodus with food, and it was kind of cool. But they looked to the children and say, you were slaves in Egypt. And I said, I've never been a slave. I've never been to Egypt. And it took a while for me to figure out what it meant was that story was not the property of one people, of one time or one place. It was a story told generation after generation. And you kind of had to figure out, were you with those guys with the horses and the chariots, or were you with those people who were trying to make a pathway to a land of promise for themselves? Civil rights movement told that story. Dr. King literally told the same story. And it was a movement of young people. You know, Walter Brueggemann, the Protestant theologian, wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination. He says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of two elements. One he calls criticality, the other, which is a clear view of the world's pain, of its hurt, of its need. The other, he says, he describes as hope, a sense of its promise and possibilities. The intersection, one without the other, goes to despair or it goes to irrelevance. The intersection can lead to the energy for transformation and change. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. For my generation, that was why many of us became involved in the civil rights movement. So as we're sitting there in silence, a young woman named Jean Wheeler, a SNCC organizer, stood up in the back. She began to sing, "They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we struggled so long, we must be free. They say freedom is a constant dying. We've died too long. We must be free." And as she stood up and began to walk out of the room, one by one, everybody fell in behind her, and the next day, everyone went to Mississippi. Now, that was a turning point experience for me, because my education about race, power, and politics in America, with all due respect to Harvard, began in Mississippi. It was so evident, the inequalities of housing, healthcare, education, you name it, between whites and blacks. But it was also clear that bringing a few medical supplies or some books wasn't going to make any difference. It would make the person who brought them would feel good. And that's when I began to learn the difference between charity and justice. That charity sort of says, what's wrong? Let me help. And justice says, why is it happening? Let me change it. And when you ask those questions, let me change it, what's happening, that's where it gets tough. Because what you often learn is that these people don't have over here, they don't have enough over here, because these people have too much over here. And when the people who don't have enough begin to try to change things, folks over here resist, and there we get into conflict. And it turns out actually that conflict can be the midwife of growth, of change, and of learning. And not something to fear, but something to be embraced in this kind of a context. And so the challenge was how to rebalance the power, because that's what it was. It was a power problem. Blacks couldn't vote. Unprotected by the labor laws, it protected non-agricultural workers. And I'd never had the experience of going up to someone twice my age who would stand up, offer me his chair, call me mister, introduce himself with his first name, not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white. And that went on thousands of times a day across the South. So you put together the cultural and economic and political powerlessness that the African American community was experiencing, and then you begin to understand why all that inequality. So how do you fix it? Well, some people thought you go to the government, you go to Washington, D.C., hi, can we have a little bit of your power? That didn't go so well. That was like, we need more data, we need more research, testify before our committee. We discovered that unless the people with the problem could also become authors of the solution, it was not going to be solved. But they don't have any power. The breakthrough there was the discovery in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. Everybody's heard of Rosa Parks? Rosa Parks, the woman who, you know, the buses were segregated then, blacks in the back, whites in the front, no man's land in the middle. A white deputized bus driver was armed, deputized bus driver. You had to walk past to find a seat if you were black in the back. If a white person needed a seat, you had to get up and give it to them. A lot of anger about this. The year before, the Supreme Court had declared segregation unconstitutional in schools. And so the people in Montgomery said, well, maybe we can do something about buses. We need a plaintiff, we need somebody to get arrested, so we can file a lawsuit just like they did. That was Rosa Parks. But when she got arrested, the Women's Committee at the college there decided we can't let her go to jail by herself. We need to all show solidarity with her. They went to Dr. King and the others and said, let's get everybody to stay off the buses one day. Let's show solidarity. That Monday morning, there's a description of Dr. King getting up. The buses go by. There isn't a single black face on the bus. And at that moment, that community began to look at itself differently. Look what we just did. Powerlessness fragments you and divides you. That act of solidarity lifted that community's understanding of itself so that that night it decided that they would just stay off those buses until they won. And what they discovered then was, in fact, they did have a source of power. They did have resources. Everybody in that community had resources. And if you look down, you can see what resources they had, because you have them too. They're called feet. And as long as they use their feet to walk to work and deny the bus company their bus fare instead of using their feet to get on the bus and give the bus company their bus fare, it turned out the bus company became more dependent on them than they on the bus company. And in that way, individual resources used collectively became a source of collective power. Now, that was what sparked the civil rights movement, was not the litigation, but the discovery that ordinary people could combine their resources in such a way as to become a source of power. That you're not starting with deficit, but starting with asset. How do we combine in order to do that? Well, I got hooked on that, and instead of coming back to Harvard at the end of a year and a half in the South, I actually wrote him a letter, how can I come back and study history when we're busy making it, which was kind of arrogant. But also true. Instead, I went back to California, where I grew up in Bakersfield, California, oil and agriculture town, where Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike that the picture is from. And I'd grown up in the farm worker world, but never seen it. I had to go to Mississippi and get what we call Mississippi eyes to come back home, see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections, and California with its own rich history of racial discrimination going back to the Chinese, the Japanese, as late as the 50s, desegregating movie theaters in LA that had Mexicans upstairs and whites downstairs. It turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America, but an example of the America we needed to change. So I began to work with Cesar and did that for the next 16 years up until 1981, which is really where I learned this craft of organizing in politics and community work and with unions and so forth. I did another 10 years of union issue and electoral work, mostly in California, and then was invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard, even though I'd never graduated. I still had that year to go. And I was puzzled until I recalled that there was a dropout up in Seattle who had done rather well, and Harvard had some incentive to invite this person that started a small software company up there. That wasn't my situation, but I was feeling stuck, and so I ran into a 20-year-old version of me that said, how's it going? I said, I don't know, I need to find a way to go deeper and broader. And so 20-year-old me said, well, why don't you come back and finish that senior year? I said, I don't know if my synapses still work, I don't know. The tuition has changed just a little bit. But in 1991, I came back and did, in fact, finish my senior year, wrote a senior thesis in history and government, graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate, so I got to close that particular loop. But I got hooked, did a master's at the Kennedy School, and then a PhD in sociology. And while working on the PhD, was asked to design a course on organizing for the Kennedy School. Now, that was a gift to me because it was a way to integrate my life experience with social science in a pedagogical conversation with a rising generation. I mean, I got to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool for your own learning as well as the learning that you're sharing. And so I've been on the faculty full-time since 2000 and teach a course in organizing in the spring, which is a practice-based course, a distance learning version that I'm doing now with about 120 people in some 20 countries. And I teach a course on public narrative in the fall. And since 2003, mainly through my students, got involved back into the world of practice with the Howard Dean campaign in 2003, bringing tools of organizing to that. With President Obama's campaign in 2007-8, the Camp Obamas offering the skills of organizing and practice, with the Dreamers, with other groups since then. So that's kind of where I am. And the frameworks and the approaches to the work of social change have come out of this combination of experience and social science and a whole lot of teaching. I think of the framework not so much as a model, but as a pedagogy, a pathway to learning. And it's based on 5 practices that I'll just mention, I think, how they work. The first one is relationship building. The fundamentals of organizing are in the building of relationships, not the aggregation of individual voices, but the formation of collective capacity. It's association that enables us to come out of our individual interests and understand our broader common interests. This was de Tocqueville's whole argument about the role of civic associations in the United States. It was the association of people one with another that creates the potential for learning. And not simply as transactions, but as commitments to work together, which is what introduces the possibility of transformation, of learning, of change, and of growth. So the relational foundation is fundamental. At the other end is action, and that is the actual mobilizing and deployment of resources, whether it's votes, money, people, whatever, in such a way as to influence the power dynamics that are at work, that are responsible for whatever the problem is. It's not just an action, it's integrated. And the integration occurs through 3 core practices at the center between relationships and action. The first one is narrative or storytelling as a way in which to access the emotional resources in our values to find sources of courage and solidarity and hope, to do the heart work, to answer the question, why does this matter? Second is strategizing, which is how to turn what we have, resources we have, into the power that we need to get what we want. And that's the second one, strategizing. It's about how, in Montgomery, they turned resources into sources of power. And power is pretty easy to understand. I mean, if your need for my resources is greater than my need for your resources, who's got the power? If your need for my resources is greater than my need for your resources, who's got the power? Right, it's an influence created through relationship. It's relational, it's not a thing. It's an interdependence between need and resource. And sometimes, by collaborating, we can then create more power, like in a cooperative, because our interests converge. When our interests differ, sometimes we have to figure out how to use our resources in such a way as to alter the interests of those who are opposed to our own. And that's what they did in Montgomery, Alabama. But the use of power, through the strategic use of power, is fundamental in this whole exercise. And since you're often David dealing with Goliath, you have to figure out how to compensate for resources you don't have with greater resourcefulness. Gandhi always emphasized the significance of creativity, of imagination, of being able to find ways, like they did in Montgomery, to turn what you have into what you need to get what you want. Like American colonists did here when they dumped tea into Boston Harbor, and they got everybody, it was a tea boycott is what it was. Affect the tax to the British, affect the British merchants economically, and also show you we're an American by drinking coffee and not tea. So there have been many ways in which this works. Third is structure, and structuring our work. So you can think of it, story is why this matters, strategy is how we're going to fix it, and structure is how we organize ourselves to fix it. And that last one I just want to underscore, because social movements are often born in opposition to oppressive structures. So they often interpret structure as inherently oppressive. Then you have a problem, because then you get often into what feminist sociologist Joe Freeman described as the tyranny of structurelessness. In other words, we're here, we have no structure, we have no leaders, we're just all equal here, everybody decides. Guess what, points out Joe Freeman. We still structure ourselves, but it's off the books instead of on the books. It's personalistic, it's unaccountable, it's not transparent. And we wonder, who's really making decisions here? You know what I'm talking about. We've all had that kind of experience. So my argument about structure is that either you own it, you're transparent about it, you become accountable, and you use it for purposes of coordination and strategizing and commitment and follow-up, or not. That's your choice. And it's a little bit like being preoccupied with freedom from what you're trying to get free of, but understanding that unless you also embrace the conditions of freedom to work together to achieve what you want to achieve, you get stuck. And so that's where this structure piece becomes a very important thing. So those are the 5 practices: relationships, story, strategy, structure, and action. And usually it's orchestrated in the form of campaigns, because campaigns are based on the idea that you build the resources you need in the course of your journey. It's a little bit like agile as opposed to waterfall, because you're going into the unknown, and so as you venture forth, you learn by setting goals for yourself, and then you learn to create a second one and a third one. We call that a campaign structure, but it's based on the idea Stephen Jay Gould talked about time being of 2 kinds: time as a cycle, rhythm of continuity, and time as an arrow, rhythm of change. In my experience, organizing and campaigns operate through time as an arrow. It's intense, it's episodic, it's focused, and it gets us from here to there. And the last thing I'll say about that, and I'll say, period, is that my old friend Tom Hayden, who passed away a couple months ago, who was the leader in the anti-war movement, he used to say, change is slow except when it's fast. We are in a fast moment right now. We're in a fast moment in this country. We're in a fast moment in much of the world when there is a lot of fluidity. A lot of us woke up on November the 9th and found that change is not always the happiest thing in the world, but can in fact be profoundly challenging. And the question that many of us, I think, face now is whether to remain in a sort of state of disorientation about that, or whether to see it as an opportunity to sort of clear the decks and rebuild. For me, resistance is not enough. It's about creation. It's about rebuilding. It's about moving forward. And I think that's where we need to put our energy. There's an extraordinary kind of solidarity in the face of a shared threat right now that cuts across so many communities. The question is whether, whoever thought there'd be a March for Science except here at MIT? Pretty amazing. Climate March and so forth. The question is whether that kind of solidarity can be turned into pursuit of a shared purpose, not just reaction to a shared threat. And I think that's where the work is that we have to do. I also think that's the opportunity we have right now. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Marshall. That was great. I wanted to start maybe by I think at least the last conversation I had here was with Jamila Rakib, who actually I think was a student of yours.
I see Jamila.
There she is.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, is apparently nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
Everybody should cheer for her.
Yes.
But I hope I don't misrepresent her work, but she's very focused on this craft of nonviolent action. And I think, and Jamila, raise your hand, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think Gene Sharp and Jamila's craft is really focusing on the sort of science and the training of the people in this craft of nonviolent action, with the idea that everyone should know how to do this, and that will make the world less violent. You're very skilled in the craft of organizing. I think Jamila says the extent to which she gets criticism, sometimes people may object to the neutrality in which they will train a variety of people on this craft of nonviolent action. So it's interesting because it's sort of a layer, and they don't, as far as I know, Gene Sharp and Jamila don't strongly support one particular politics over another. They're very nonpartisan in the way that they do this work. And you're teaching this class on organizing, right? So you have anybody can take your class, and they could be interested in organizing just about anything. So it could be an NRA march, right? And so I'm curious where you fall in terms of, do you feel that you have a very specific set of politics or beliefs and values that you're, as a rabbi's son, that you're going after, or are you a craftsman in organizing?
Well, it's a really good way to pose it. I guess the reason that I describe what I teach as practices is that I think they have conceptual elements, they have behavioral elements, they're skills, but they also have values content. That the values assumptions in this approach, as I think to nonviolence generally, there's some pretty strong values there. It may not be partisan, but it's very political. I mean, it's about power and politics and the way the world is arranged. That doesn't mean partisan, but it does mean a point of view and a perspective. And, you know, I think nonviolence itself is an expression of a very clear set of values. Actually, it's unfortunate that it's called nonviolence. When I was trained in nonviolence in the civil rights movement and with the farm workers, which is also a nonviolent movement, we understood satyagraha, truth force, it is a way to do things. It's not a way not to do things. And anytime we were working with people in stressful situations, like on picket lines or whatever, it wasn't enough to say, don't do that. It was say, do this. Have a fast. Have a pilgrimage. Join a boycott. It was coming up with creative ways to act. So it was never non-anything. And I think that's an unfortunate translation because it is actually a way to. Now, it did happen that my approach to leadership development, which we call a snowflake, it's sort of a cascaded distributed leadership model, turned up on the Koch brothers website where they were offering training to some of their folks. So I guess, I don't know, imitation is a sort of form of flattery.
But how do you feel about
it? Well, fine. Look, if they embody the values that are at the core of what I'm teaching, go for it.
Yeah.
See, I think the question is, there gets to be a dissonance. If you are looking at people instrumentally rather than looking at people as ends in themselves, you approach it very differently. I distinguish, for example, between marketing and movement building. There's a lot of marketing that goes on or mobilizing in the political domain where just turn them out, just get their signatures. It's purely instrumental. It's not engaging with people in a relational way. And so that's one of the sharp distinctions I make between marketing and movement building. And I think the values are sort of built into the practices if the practices are practiced the way that they're meant to be.
Yeah, and you're probably right. I just poke at this because as somebody who was involved in the early days of the internet, we thought that as long as we connect everybody together, they'll just talk and we'll have democracy and we'll have peace. And we thought that we had locked into the internet the values of the people who were building it. And probably in your practice there's more of it locked in. But these things can evolve and turn into interesting things. And I would say, and I think you did an analysis, I read an article about your sort of post-election analysis of what happened. And it's kind of interesting to look at how, I wrote a book recently about sort of how you think about living in the world today and about how to use networks. And if I had to guess whether Trump or Hillary's group had read the book, I would have guessed Trump had read the book, right? I mean, he embodied a lot of the, at least at the operational level, a lot of the values and a lot of the thinking that we on the internet thought were useful. Grassroots, very agile, you're pulling instead of pushing. And so I'm curious, I guess, about two things. One, I'd love to hear about what you think about what actually happened, because I enjoyed your analysis, but also the extent to which, whether in your case, the organizing actually does have the values locked in a way that is hard to.
I think it's a really important point. I think there's a difference between designing tools and teaching people. And I think that tools can be used in many, many different ways. I don't think of what I'm teaching as tools. I think of them as practices that people learn to act on their circumstances. And, because tools can be used all kinds of different ways. This distance learning class that I teach, there's no way I could do it without the internet. I mean, I can work with people all over the world, we can look at each other, we can build relationships, but it can also be used in a very different way. I think I like to think, and maybe this is not entirely the case, but I'd like to think that the practices that I'm working with are ways of equipping people to act in the world and use tools rather than be tools. And I think it's that question of agency. Where is the agency located? Is it in the tool, or is it in the human beings using the tools? And obviously that's a major question. But I think of what I do as trying to enhance agency and collective agency the best I can. On Trump, yeah, it's pretty interesting. You can mobilize, I think, around fear or hope. When you mobilize around fear of the sources of anxiety and problem, usually what happens is that you're mobilizing people around fear and perhaps anger, in which case you become the source of salvation. In other words, you're offering people a way out of their agency, not embracing them. Rely on me, I will deliver you, and I will deliver you from these other people out there who are trying to take away from you. So you build a sort of a wall, so to speak, and you create this profound dependency. And I think that's what demagogic mobilizing is. When you mobilize around hope, you're actually enhancing agency. Obama didn't say, yes, I will. He said, yes, we can. I mean, that's a very important distinction, because the we includes all of us in it, in which case then we're equipping ourselves to actually deal with what the real sources of our problems are. Not that it always works that way, but I think I think one of the problems is that a lot of progressives have a kind of view of emotion as problematic, as like, ooh, emotion. We got to be rational and reasonable, and that emotion stuff, that's a black box, that's dangerous stuff. Well, here's the problem. If the language of values is emotion, it's through emotion. And unless we can learn to speak that language as well as the opposition in terms of our values, then we're abandoning the turf. Pascal said the heart has reason of which reason does not know. The realm of emotion is not just crazy irrationality, it's a meaning, but it's making meaning in a different way. And I think that really we're obligated to master that craft, which is what the narrative stuff is all about, as opposed to abandoning the turf to the Trumps of this world.
So I'm going to poke a little bit more sort of at the same thing, but in a tangent. We've recently, or last year, we announced a disobedience prize.
Right.
It's a $250,000 prize for disobedience. It didn't get much attention until this year when we opened the nominations. I think disobedience is more popular these days.
Yes.
And but we've been getting pushback, and it's sparked a vibrant conversation, because we're trying to give an award to people who are engaged in disobedience, but not people who have already finished or are already super well known. We're trying to find people in the process of doing it. And it's pretty easy in retrospect. I mean, whether we're talking about a university or whether we're talking about a city, we celebrate the Boston Tea Party now.
Right.
But I'm sure back then a lot of people thought it was a pretty bad idea, right?
Yeah.
So and what I'm not sure about, and one of the questions I have is, again, everything in hindsight, the civil rights movement, obviously right idea, but I think Lessig actually teaches a course of all these laws that seem absolutely ridiculous if you looked at it in one time period. But after a certain point, they suddenly become obvious, right? So in the act of getting a bunch of people around an idea, those people may feel it's a moral imperative, but they may be wrong, right? And I suppose if you believe in absolute truth, you might be able to say, well, there's some people are right and some people are wrong. But how do you think about the sort of fuzzy morality of a collective action around? I mean, do you see where I'm going? So if a group of students came to you and said, you know what, we want you to help us organize, and we believe this, and you're not sure, well, what happens?
It depends. It depends. I mean, I think first there's the question of what are the values that are involved. If you think in terms of dignity and compassion, equality, if you think of those kinds of core values, that's not a bad place to operate from. And sometimes they conflict with the law, the ways of doing things, often, sometimes not. I mean, and that's how we make choices. I mean, I applied for one of these global entry things to be able to, well, they dug up the fact that I had like 13 arrests from mostly Mississippi and California, involved in civil rights work or in work with farm workers. I guess we were being disobedient. But you have to make these judgments about what, so to speak, I was going to say what trumps what. I won't use that phrase. But yeah, you have to make these choices, right? And they may be right, they may be wrong. I think I'd look at the question of courage. I think usually the choices we make out of fear are pretty bad ones. I think the ones we make out of hope and courage tend to be better. But isn't it a question of just making these judgments the best you can?
And so you would encourage the students to look inside and make their determination on whether they believe what they were doing was just.
I think so. And so I teach the organizing class at Kennedy School, so every year the deans have to figure out how to deal with some of the students who decide that things ought to be different there.
Right.
And that's a good process, I think.
Because even nonviolence, I mean, it depends on the context, right? I mean, I know Jamelia would say violence is not the right strategy in any case, but like you go back to some of our heroes like Harriet Tubman, I'm sure she shot people, right? That she was in the army, but she's an important figure, and I guess how much of it is, and the reason I point this out also is that a lot of let me call the new generation of organizers, like the Anonymouses or the Occupy folks, or maybe some of the other more radical groups online, seem to have a different approach, and they feel like the Gandhis of the world. We can't do that anymore. That kind of mythical nonviolent action just doesn't work. The bad guys are more sophisticated. We're under surveillance. You guys are living in a fairyland, and so I guess this is two questions. So how much of what you're talking about, and I mean I think the answer is, I can guess the answer, applies to the movements today, and then how much leeway do you have in the core principles of what you think people need to do?
Whoa, those are big questions. I don't know what to do with that. No, I think look, I mean, when we were doing, when I was working for SNCC and in civil rights work, I mean, clearly we knew a whole lot that the previous generations didn't know. I mean, clearly, well, our life experience was different. There's this song that I often quote from the civil rights movement that Judy Collins recorded. It goes, "Freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother, pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it, they have to fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again." I think that is how it is. And we learn. And, we learn, and when we're open to learning from the past, that's important. But we're also living in a different world. So, I don't know, to me it's an ongoing process of learning and growth and development. I do think that the sort of enchantment with no structure, that's been around at least since the Anabaptists in the Reformation, because it is a natural response to oppressive structure. And I think movements that mature and grow in their capacity move through that to where they then become capable of being strategic. American history, reform politics in the U.S. is a question of movements and parties, really. And movements have been the big generators of change, whether from the right or from the left. And so movements have played a critical role, but it's movements that have been able to kind of move through to get to that freedom to part that they become effective.
And that seems also one of the double edge or the things about online movements now. It's so easy to organize a protest, but sometimes you don't have to build that institution anymore, so you don't have it around to do the follow-up.
Yeah, this is, and Zeynep Tufekci has done her research on this. It's terrific. Yeah, it's exactly the problem. And a lot of it is the aggregation of individual resource. It's not building collective capacity. But I think we're learning to do that better. I mean, we had this resistance school at the Kennedy School. The students put together. I don't know if folks have heard about this. It was 4 sessions, 1 a week, online that they invited people to. And we did a session on how to launch a leadership team. It was an hour and a half. About 100 people came locally. We showed a video of how you go through all the steps. 40,000 people came in over the internet. The appetite out there for learning is just phenomenal. And we're learning how to do it better and how to use these tools in this way.
And I don't know if, I think Matt Dunn's project is still a secret project, but he's here, I think, working on thinking about how to create these institutions and these systems. We have, I know the students had an independent study period here in January, and I think over 200 students, I think, signed up for that. There's clearly a desire to sort of learn. I know Jamila's been advising students. And so then the meta question, and then I'll open it up to everybody else that I have as you know, it's kind of like when you're the dog chasing the bus and then you catch it. You know, you and I are fighting the man, and now we are sort of the man. We're kind of in an institution, right?
Speak for yourself.
No, you got your PhD. I don't even have one of those. You know, so I mean,
you're more disobedient.
But you're a credentialed, you know, faculty at Harvard, right? So at some level, you know, we have some responsibility because we have an ability to influence at least the institutions that we belong to. And, you know, I like to think at the Media Lab level that we're disobedience robust, that disobedience makes us stronger, makes us more creative, and any scientist who wouldn't want their advisee to question the theories that they've come up with, that's bad for science, right? And it should be the same for democracy, it should be the same for everything. In this moment that we have, students showing up, people dropping into our labs, wanting to organize, everybody wants to do, what's the right stance for the institution? Because I feel that we could do more as institutions, but it's also fake at some level if the institution itself is pretending to do things. The disobedience prize was funny because we had all these qualifiers, nonviolence, social, and some kids on the internet said, "Oh, that sounds like an obedience prize," you know. And so at some level, it's inauthentic if we're too disobedient. What do you think about that?
Oh boy, what a great question. I don't, you know, and I've certainly thought about it in the context of the Kennedy School, which is one of the places that certainly teaches neoliberal economics, which is deeply in contrast to what my values are. I think institutions like these colleges and universities have the benefit of a constant engagement with the future in the form of their students. Now, if they receive that and respond to it, as opposed to trying to suppress it, it is a form of ongoing renewal. Unfortunately, as you know, oftentimes we get stuck. And we get stuck in just the way it is. Then the pressure builds, hopefully. Then there's, you know, a showdown of some kind. And then maybe there's change, or maybe not. But I think our institutions have this built-in generational dynamic that we are fools not to embrace. I think That's certainly what I'm trying to do. I think it's what you're trying to do. And I think
So are you calling the people who aren't embracing it fools? Is that what you just did?
Well, maybe stuck a little bit. Maybe stuck a little bit. It's, change is challenging, isn't it?
Because most of the life of an institution is fundraising, protecting, all those things about structure which aren't about disruption, and building in a way that's flexible enough to not only sustain that but to get stronger it's a different kind of design.
But of course, where it ultimately goes is no change. I mean, it ossifies and stops, and that's like death. I mean, that's the end of things. That's when I say conflict is constructive. I think it's necessary for change and growth and development. Certainly in our politics, it's necessary. But it takes. It takes, I think, the right kind of support, the right kind of understanding, courage, really, to welcome it and not try to suppress it. And it seems to me that's very much what you're all about doing here.
We try, but you can ask the students later. So we could start taking some questions from the audience. There's a mic here if anybody has anything. And also, Janine, you can raise, there's one here. Janine, if you have something from Twitter, you.
Hi, thank you. So I'm wondering about, you made reference to going through these ebbs and flows of periods where change happens very fast and then where it's sort of sustained. And it seems like, and this could just be totally a perspective distortion thing, but it seems like change, let's say over the past 100 years or something, there are more pockets of time where it happened slowly, at least in terms of the United States and its social structure. And then there are these periods of sort of like rupture that take place. And it seems like the period that we're in now is sort of this accelerating period that isn't really going to slow down in some way. And there's this liquefying moment where there are possibilities for expanding social justice, and at the same time, there's this fear of how quickly it could just descend into fascism. And I really think that's the appropriate word, actually, fascism, historically speaking. And so I'm wondering, in terms of thinking about, organizing and, progressive values, like, if you're just reacting, how do you know where you're going? Because it seems like part of the reason why things change more slowly is because the left is sort of in a position of defending itself rather than like pushing for other than in these moments where like it actually feels like so much energy is just going into averting, I don't know, something really horrible things.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just wondering, like, I guess in your perspective, do you think that sense of time or the speed of, which things can sort of change can happen quickly or not? Like, do you think that's sort of a distortion of the time that you're in? And if you do think that, what I propose of maybe we're in a time where it's not really going to slow down, what sort of sustains you and gives you a sense of actually like being able to not just be in a position of reacting and actually sort of having a different relation to the whole?
Okay, there's a bunch of stuff there, I think. Our perception of the time we're in is our perception of the time we're in. Having the advantage of a few more years on the planet, the last time I experienced this kind of fluidity, I would say, was in the late 60s. And I can pinpoint a moment when I felt it shift, which was the night Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated. We were at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles celebrating the victory. The farm workers turned out to vote in East Los Angeles, and we thought we had a moment that was going to take this country in one direction, and an assassin's bullet essentially took it in a different direction. And I've always felt that those moments in 1968 felt like a real shift, and then a lot of stuff flowed from that. Now, this feels like another moment like that. It's different. It's come in a different form. But, you know, the shock this whole country experienced the day after that election was like, wake up, smell the coffee here. Look what's been happening for 40 years that created the conditions for this. To me, the point was not that Hillary could have won with 70,000 more votes or whatever it was, that Trump could even be conceivable as a candidate in this country is appalling. And it reflects a lot of stuff that's been happening. It's been like the frog, you know, slowly boiling is what's been going on. That's why I think we have an opportunity now. And when our choices really matter. It's as if it sort of cleared away a lot of stuff. And now, there is a problem, which is that I think the progressive world is behind on coming up is doing the intellectual work necessary to offer a clear alternative. You know, it's sort of, you know, Gramsci wrote, there are times when the old is dead, but the new hasn't yet been born, and it's very confusing. And I think there's an enormous amount of creative, intellectual, and organizing work to do to reconfigure progressive politics in response to this moment. And I don't think we know exactly what form it's going to take, but I think that's one of the major jobs that we all have to do.
Andy and then Vicky, or sorry.
Hi, my name's Jeff. I've been having a bit of a question post-Passover 2017 that maybe you can help with. So the narrative goes that Moses, one of the Jewish people, was the leader of their own sort of redemption. And I think oftentimes when we think about the end of slavery, that narrative sometimes changes to it was the white people in the North that created that freedom for the blacks in the South, and I think missing out on the narrative of how blacks in the South took a lot of that in their own hands, that isn't central necessarily to the narrative. And I'm wondering how you sort of opened with that sense of Exodus as a unifying story, but I started to feel this difference in how we were interpreting it and haven't resolved that yet.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting, I mean, the Moses story is such an interesting story because first of all, he's a Jew who was an Egyptian. He was of the oppressed, raised in the house of the oppressor. That dual identity of inside, outside, I think has often been associated with social movements because there's the intimate knowledge of the pain, but there's also the sense of possibility. And unless those two are present, you get stuck. And, you know, I mean, Martin Luther King, for example, you know, his father was pastor of the Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, an aristocratic black church, as was his grandfather, his PhD here at BU, was King an outsider or an insider when it came to someone working on a plantation in Mississippi? Well, in some ways an insider, in some ways an outsider. So I think that sort of insider-outsider dynamic is a really, really, really important one. The Exodus story is also interesting because, you know, the people aren't able to grasp their freedom. It sort of takes a whole lot of agitation by Moses. And finally, when they're able to come out, so to speak, when they mark their houses with the blood, now we're getting into sort of some mythological stuff here, but they have to take an action to declare themselves. They have to step up and declare themselves to actually put their feet on the pathway to a kind of freedom or a kind of redemption. So I think, I mean, there's a dual dynamic going on there. I mean, the anti-slavery movement is certainly an extraordinary movement. The Quakers were key in making it happen, and it was very much focused in trying to change the policy in Britain and the US and so forth. But of course, there was always resistance. You know, I mean, Nat Turner, I mean, on and on. There was always resistance. It kept getting crushed. And so it took an alliance, it took an inside-outside combination, I think, to really open things up, just like in South Africa. It took an inside-outside combination. With the farm workers, we'd go on strike, they got replaced. We had to organize a boycott of grapes all over the place, and inside-outside combination. And I think how we leverage those things opens up space. But I think the big difference is whether we're trying to do something for others or whether we're engaging with others in what is a common project. And I think the latter is the ones that actually get purchased. The former ones, I don't think, work so well. Is that responsive? So? All right.
So Vicky, next, maybe.
So I love this idea of the individual power coming together to pool resources to get collective power. And then also this notion that change moves slowly except for when it's fast. And those two concepts for me come together to sort of fuel one thing I'm worried about, the idea of normalization, with everybody coming together, that hive mind mentality, but then also things happening so quickly that it's the rapid exposure can lead to normalization and then complacency over time. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how to be a leader and organize against complacency and normalization.
Well, be more specific. Give me an example.
So I guess with the leading up to the election of Trump, one shoe would fall and everybody would say, this is it, this is the end of Trump's campaign. And then something more extreme would come,
right,
and more extreme, and
right,
more extreme. And at every moment, people are like, this is as bad as it could get. It can't get worse. And then it gets worse and worse. And then if we then compare it to the earlier situations, things don't seem so bad. So just how our the activation level for our frustration or fear becomes higher and higher with each event. So then even when a little action, well, something that's then can be viewed as a little action relative to the bigger picture is taken as being not a big problem.
Are you saying like we get numb?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because there was, I mean, if you think about the stuff leading up to the election, there was just a whole lot of denial. I mean, I wouldn't call it numbness, I would call it denial, and just a refusal to believe that this was happening or could happen. And we're really good at that. We are really good at that. And we're really good at screening out anything that's dissonant with what we already think or believe. One of the big challenges in organizing is to break through that. You know, now sometimes it happens, like Trump got elected. Boy, whoa, wait, what just happened? Now we need to rethink things. Sometimes organizers have to figure out how to break through the habitual in order to get a moment recognized as a moment that requires action. Climate change arguably has had that problem. How to make the important urgent is one of the big challenges when it comes to organizing. Often it means figuring out how to take action that creates a kind of moral urgency. In a way, that's what King was doing in the South with some of the marches and demonstrations. It's sort of like okay, Saul Alinsky, the organizer, community organizer, said organizers have to be well-integrated schizoids because you have to polarize to mobilize and depolarize to settle. Now, what he was talking about was not like left-right polarization. He was talking about cutting an issue so that it becomes a choice. And either you're this way or you're that way. Either, you know, we're for the right to vote or we're against it. Either people can sit in lunch counters or they can't. There's a crystallizing, and that helps create an urgency that then can produce a choice or not. But sometimes, though, things happen. And this is one of those things happen moments. And so now the question is to step up to that, I think, and respond to it in really constructive ways. Is that? All right, thanks.
Andy, and then Matt.
Yeah.
Andy, and then.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
I want to, first of all, thank you for your talk. It's an honor to listen to you and hear all of the things that you had to say. I agree with you entirely that it does feel like the 60s again, and I'm probably one of the few people in this room as old as you who lived through it and saw it. And one of the things that was true at that time was you were either for us or against us. That's what we said about the Vietnamese War, right? There was no time for neutrality. And we may be reaching a time where there is no time for neutrality again, and we have to actually act strategically and in concert to kind of fix things. But the thing that's particularly troubling to me is another reason that it's like the 60s again is because I think one thing we learned is how little has changed. That indeed we've done several tactical moves and given people rights to vote, or given people rights to housing, or given people rights to education. But one thing that this election seemed to have brought out is that it was voiced best by Judy Jackson, who's MIT's diversity officer. And she said for the last 100 years or so, there's a number of people in this country, a category of people, who have promulgated the notion that they own the country and everyone else is a guest. They are their guests. And if you view things through that lens, then you can see that, like they're the hosts and you're the guests. And if you're not obeying the rules of being a guest, then that's the violation. And you can combine that with, Ellie Hochschild's view of humiliation in the South against the Northerners. And I guess the problem that I'm grappling with, because in my group next door, we've done a little bit of work on trying to organize people in a grassroots fashion to take political action, and there's a lot of people doing that. But the question is, what is the action that we have to take when in reality is that underlying attitude that there's a class of people who claim to own the country, and that all of the immigrants, all of the women, all of the blacks, and all of everyone else is merely a guest in that country?
Let me respond.
The real question is, how do you get to there?
Let me try to respond this way. I think one of the lessons is that that equality is indivisible. In other words, if you fight for racial equality, but you abandon economic equality, or you fight for economic equality and you abandon racial equality or gender equality, they're indivisible. They're all intimately related. Today they call intersectionality, but in reality, it seems to me that's how it is. And it seems like after the 60s, we focused a lot more on race and gender, which opened up pathways, vertical pathways into institutions, but we did nothing about class. And so even communities of color, some of whom made it up into the upper reaches, majorities did not, because there was a whole economic dimension to the whole thing. And so it seems to me that what this wake-up call, from my perspective, is it's not class over race, or they got to all come together. And if they don't come together, the democratic project is deeply problematic. And they each have their own sources of inequality and have to be struggled with. I think that's a big challenge for the progressive world right now, is to get that and get what's needed in order to take on the whole thing, including what you're describing, which I think also relates a lot to the economics, as well as to race and gender and the other concerns.
Can we get Alexandra and then Matt? Is that okay?
Thank you so much. Firstly, it's an honor to be here and hear your talk. As a neuroscientist and a folk singer, I feel that cognitive studies are really just beginning to grasp the impact of sound upon the brain. I like to say science has to catch up to understand what the heart already knows. In your talk today, you cited a few songs, Judy Collins singing "Freedom Doesn't Come Like a Bird on the Wing," or how many followed the woman to Mississippi who's saying freedom is a constant struggle. I would love to hear about your perspective on the role of music in these movements.
Oh, boy. It's interesting. We had a visit to my class 2 weeks ago of John Lewis. And it was great for people to have an opportunity to meet him. Talk about integrity and courage. Boy, do we need more of that. And one of the things he talked about was music, and the fact that real movements sing. And I think because musical expression enables a kind of how can I say? It's like narrative in a way. It's a language of emotion, And it enables solidarity, it enables sources of hope, it enables access to courage, it enables so much. And, you know, in the civil rights movement, one of its great resources was song. Of course, it came out of a church tradition. But, you know, anytime people would wind up in jail, somebody would start singing, and then in another cell, somebody else. And then you were all there together. And so there was, see, we think about movements, well, they do actions and they have meetings. They also need to celebrate. And by celebration, I don't mean go have a beer. I mean, that's fine. But I mean, honor the values, experience the values that they are honoring through their work and what they're trying to do. And musical expression is one of the key ways of doing that. So I really appreciate your raising that. And I think you can kind of tell a lot about movements whether the music's real or fake. I mean, it was just, oh, let's go sing that old song from 50 years ago. Oh, aren't we militant? Well, yeah, maybe not. I mean, I think that the voice, it's an expression of authentic voice. I could go on this, but in the farm worker movement, we had something, the Teatro Campesino. Luis Valdez organized that. And it was farm workers' theater, and he was influenced by Bertolt Brecht, he was influenced by the mime troupe, but it was a form of theater that taught, that celebrated, that made fun of, that had song. And in every farm worker town, there was somebody who was writing corridos. Corridos are like Mexican popular ballads, and there was always be somebody who had the corrido de Cesar Chavez, or the corrido. There was a corrido of the short-handled hoe, which was something farm workers hated. And so this was a song about the end of the short. So anyway, yes, I think it's really important. Yeah, thanks for raising that. I think we often really miss that.
So, as a Vermonter, I haven't heard you mention Bernie Sanders in this conversation.
I'm sorry.
And well, I think it's interesting in movement politics that I think there was some denial in the Democratic Party.
Some?
Or quite a bit, of the fact, and in some ways similar to the way the general public treated Trump early on. There was a lot of mockery of Bernie and whether he was real or whether he was trucking people into the rallies or if he could actually raise money without picking up the phone and calling very wealthy people to raise that money. And those of us who are from Vermont, have seen him before, know that he doesn't see an election result as binary, right? His losing does not stop him from continuing in a movement, which is how he sees it. So I would love to hear what you think is the effect of Bernie's candidacy, both what it said about where people were, perhaps on that economic issue, as well as the effect it's going to have moving forward.
I think, you know, looking at the effects of organizing or movements, I think it's important. We sort of look at it in three ways. One is, was the immediate goal achieved, like the law was passed or whatever? The second was new capacity built? Was there a capacity for power built that wasn't there before? And third, are people learning and growing and developing as a result of their involvement? So there's like an individual, a collective, and an object sort of way of evaluating outcomes. And sometimes impact doesn't come through the first one. You may lose, but later you come back having built a base that then is a foundation for later. So I think the assessment of impact is a really important, tricky thing. And I think that's partly what you're asking. I think that Bernie's entry into the picture was obviously extremely important. There's a way to connect values to policy that the Kennedys were very good at, the Peace Corps, or put a man on the moon. Those were policy expressions of values. Trump is very good at that. Build a wall, right? A ban. Bernie came as close as anybody did on the Democratic side in the form of the college, free college for every public, so forth, universal health care, and so forth. That was utterly missing from Hillary's campaign. I mean, there was lots of policy, but it never connected to any kind of values expression in any really powerful and effective way, and it was a real problem. So I think that's one thing Bernie brought into the picture. He brought in courage and integrity because he called stuff out, and boy, was that welcome. And I think that had a lot to do with his constituency among young people. You know, he always talks about working class, but come on. I mean, a lot of his constituency were young people who weren't necessarily working class at all. But there was an aspiration, a sense of possibility and hopefulness there that was, I think, very, very important. I wish he'd done more organizing and not just mobilizing, because it was a lot of mobilizing, brilliant on the money, but it was more like Old Testament prophet at the head of the multitude, right? You know, challenging the king, which is fine, but they didn't invest in organizing. That was one thing that the Obama did do in 2007 and 8. If that had happened, I think there would be a different situation right now. It didn't happen. And so I think now sort of the question is, how do people organize? Indivisible is so interesting because they scaffolded, there's something like, they have 7,000 groups now around the country, 2 in every congressional district, because what they did was scaffold collective action. It wasn't like individuals, like form your group, go challenge your local representative, that gave feedback, and you're part of a national effort. It coupled local organization with efficacy and with a national effort. And it's very powerful. Their question now is, how do they build on that? How do they take it to the next step? How do they go from reaction to proaction? How do they do that? And you know, lots of Bernie people are involved in that, or the huddles that the Women's March is trying to have. I mean, it's just a lot of this. So I think the legacy is all out there, and I think it was a really important contribution.
So there's a woman there.
Thank you. I want to add on to your reference about the resistanceschool.com. You're the third of the fourth. This I went, and so people can check it out. I mean, they videoed, so that's really terrific on the net, on the web, and that's going to happen again. They said next semester.
Yeah.
I heard so many people just walking through the Kennedy School that I was trying to find where they were, the moving target where they were going to have the sessions, because it did move. And so many people were saying, I heard about this thing, but you know, I went there and it wasn't there, and where is it? And it was not on the roster for the events of the school that day.
Because it wasn't an official Kennedy. See, this is where,
yes.
This is interesting what Joy's talking about before. The administration worked very hard to make sure this is a student project and does not have the official endorsement and support. On the other hand, they did let it happen.
Yes.
And that was
yes,
important.
I agree. However, there's small kinds of efforts like a stapler where you use as a hammer and you put these flyers up in that morning or the day before. That works real well. I worked with Ken Burns, the filmmaker, Civil War, etc. Our history's national parks, 6 hours of all the national parks because they're not being visited and they're going away. And as a 7-year-old, he said, I'm the only one in the class. I'm here in 7th grade. I'm asking, and show and tell, he'd go back to school. And he said, well, we went to this one this summer. Did anybody go there? Nobody in 4 years. So he said, I'm going to be a filmmaker. I'm going to dedicate my life. At 7 years old. He was talking in Saunders Theater. And that's big enough. And there was nobody out there. So that there were people, finally about 12, stapling up these posters in the rain. And so it got filled.
Okay.
So that school thing is very, very important. And I thought one of the things that is disempowering to all of the kids in our generation, even at the middle school level, I think it's very, very important to honor a star of the school every day. Just on a little paper flag and or a listing in the cafeteria, even things like that. I'm not against having the additional support, but at all. But I know as a teacher of all ages, recognition on a daily basis finally gives you a little bit more courage as you're growing up. And 1 out of 4 kids do not, even in Massachusetts, 1 out of 4 does not graduate from high school because they don't see reason to. It's not because they can't or they're stupid. So that being said, those are a couple of things.
I just want to comment on, earlier I forgot, someone asked the question about sustaining over time. And I think that it has a lot to do with, whether or not there's joy in the work for you. And, you know, in other words, we were trying to sort of change the whole regime of institutionalized racism, and we still have a long way to go on that in Mississippi and so forth. But the fact that a person who had never claimed their rights before found the courage to go down to the courthouse and try to register to vote, where 3 years before someone had been killed for doing that, boy, that's a lot of inspiration. The fact that farm workers who never stood up for their rights, Filipino workers were always, these were men mostly in their 60s and 70s because of the immigration laws, couldn't immigrate families. And so it was a bachelor culture. And they were all called boys by the growers. And the first negotiation where the grower would say, "Oh, my boy over there," and we'd look around and say, "Any boys in this room? I don't see any boys. There's men here." The ways in which you can see and experience the change happen in the lives of people that you're working with, that I think it's not a substitute for changing the big institutions. And see, what I loved about organizing was it put the two together. It was like people finding ways to change themselves in such a way that they developed the power to change the institutions that had shaped their lives up to that point. And the putting of those two together, to me, that's what was so exciting and is so exciting about organizing. But I think a lot of the juice comes from those small successes that you celebrate and that you honor and understand are not sufficient, but are definitely necessary.
And just a note to speak about institutions. People should remember that we have tenure because people fought to protect freedom of academics from McCarthyism. And there's this declaration, I think it's 1940 or so, about the Declaration of Academic Freedoms. And so sometimes we forget that the institution's role is to protect that, and I think it's good timing to remember right now.
Yeah.
And then there's one last question from Twitter, Janine.
So a few different questions have come on through Twitter. I'm going to read 3 that are sort of variations on a theme, and you can parse from there.
A little louder. I have it a little.
Oh, sorry. There. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So 3 have come in. I'm going to read them all, and you can sort of parse them as you will. Do you think the fragmentation of the left is a feature or a bug? What do you do with the authoritative left? And can you speak more on the challenge of working for peace and remaining neutral politically?
Wait, I got the first one about feature or bug and fragmentation. And I think feature, but needs to be a bug. I mean, in other words, the asymmetry, they don't have to worry about heterogeneity very much over there in the NRA. Heterogeneity, diversity is inherent to what the progressive world is all about. I mean, it's a fundamental value. And that's challenging. That's not easy. And I think that's a lot of where our challenge is right now. And so, yeah, there's other forms of fragmentation that have to do with our electoral system and how it's so screwed up in terms of actually offering majoritarian representation. That's a whole other problem. But I think particular on the progressive side is this question of how we find the commonality that turns our diversity into a resource for all of us rather than the other way around. And I think that's where the work is. We had a glimpse of that in the first Obama campaign. We really did. People got out of their issue silos. I'm a tree person, I'm a fish person, identifying by issues. It's really kind of a strange way to organize politics, to be, identified by an issue, which is a strategic choice rather than a constituency or a core set of values, or so that we can make strategic choices about issues. I think that's another source of fragmentation that's very problematic, is that sort of issue silo stuff. But that's where our work is. And our project succeeds to the extent that succeeds, because that is, in so many ways, what progressive politics are about. I didn't get the other two.
The second one was similar enough that we can bypass it. The third one was, can you speak more on the challenge of working for peace and remaining neutral politically?
Wait, working for peace and
remaining neutral politically.
remaining neutral politically? Why would anybody remain neutral politically? I mean, politics is not about neutrality, is it?
Well, let me share kind of a dialogue that happens at MIT. So
Okay.
I had a dinner with some faculty, and like the March for Science, and they say, well, I don't think we should be political. And one of the other faculty said, like, for science or against science? And they said, well, no, but we might lose our funding, like the billions we just lost, And so I think there's a point at which, so I think some people would call it partisan versus nonpartisan.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting, and I think where we're struggling at MIT, among other places, is, the senior administration has to feed its children.
Yeah.
And they are afraid that becoming political partisan, you might lose a swath of funding. So that's one fear. And also there's kind of an idea that to be open and inclusive at a institutional level, you shouldn't be political, right? And I think at some point, though, and this is why the March for Science was kind of interesting. I mean, there are people that are against science. 40% of America doesn't believe in evolution, and so it's interesting what people call political these days, and so I mean, in your view, is there a like, let's call it partisan versus nonpartisan? I mean, do you feel any reason that an institution, whether it's Harvard or MIT, shouldn't be just all out fighting for its values right now?
Well, I think it should be all out fighting for its values, and to me, that's what being political is. I mean, in the civic domain. I mean, there's an economic domain, there's a civic domain, there's cultural domains, and politics is where we argue that stuff out. I really do think there's a difference between being political and being partisan. Mm-hmm. I think that parties are specific formulations. I try to be, with my students, transparent, because I don't want to pretend to a perspective that is not my own. But then by being transparent, say, okay, what you see is what you get. That's kind of how, and I actually think there's a responsibility to be a citizen. I mean, and being a citizen is not being neutral. Mm-hmm. I don't think. Being a citizen is being engaged in public life, and that means taking positions on things. I recognize the tension you're describing. I think it's, I think we got to struggle with it. I really do. And there are times when it really matters a lot. I mean, on civil rights, there was moments of truth that major institutions had to come to terms with. Were they really going to buy it or not? Mm-hmm. And I think this is another kind of time like that, but we're not quite clearly formed. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Troy?
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Marshall.
Good. Thanks a lot. Thanks very much. Thank you.